The processing dock on Veth Station smelled like salt brine, recycled air, and whatever the morning's ration allocation had burned on the bottom of the vats. I had worked the soup line there for 11 years. Before that, I had worked a soup line on a transit hub in the Outer Rim, and before that I had worked a soup line in a resettlement camp on a planet whose name I no longer say out loud because it does not exist anymore. I am good at soup lines. I know how to make a broth stretch, how to read the weight a person carries before they reach the counter, how to ladle without looking like you are counting. My name is Myra Ossel. I am 66 years old. I have no particular story to tell about myself. Except this one. The Warpack arrived at Veth Station in early autumn, if you can call the turning of the station's light cycle a season, and they were not supposed to be there. 7 Varrath-iron dragons, war-built, the kind whose ridge plates you can read like a military record if you know the sigils. They had been grounded, their transport authorization pulled mid-flight by some port council dispute I never fully understood, and they were rerouted to Dock Bay 14, the processing dock, which was the only bay with clearance capacity for a craft their size. The Varrath-iron are not small dragons. The smallest of the 7 would have been 3 meters at the shoulder, and their war leader, a female I would later learn was called Varrath-sen, though she never told me her name herself, was broad enough that she filled the service corridor end to end when she turned sideways. The station administrators put up a partition wall. They reassigned the processing queue to Bay 11. They filed 17 grievances with the Varrath Conclave's transit liaison, and then they essentially forgot that 7 Iron Dark War Dragons were living under the processing deck, because forgetting was more comfortable than dealing with it. I did not forget. I noticed them the 3rd morning, when I was carrying the early stock pots down the service corridor, and something moved in the shadow under the bay gantry. I stopped. Varrath-sen was watching me from the dark. Her eyes were amber, pale amber, like old resin, and her ridge plates were laid flat, which I later learned meant she was trying very hard not to look threatening, which for a Varrath-iron is a considerable effort. I said good morning. She did not answer. I went to work. The 4th morning I brought an extra pot. I left it at the base of the gantry steps before the line opened. I told myself it was waste reduction. We always had surplus before the lunch queue arrived, and surplus got logged and composted, and it was genuinely a logistical problem. I was solving a logistical problem. The pot was empty when I came back for it. Clean, not scraped, rinsed. I did not know at the time that Varrath-iron do not rinse containers, that they consider rinsing a borrowed vessel to be an acknowledgement of debt. I found that out later. The 2nd week I brought 2 pots. The 3rd week I brought 3, and I started adding the grain bread that came out wrong, too dense for the refugees but full of iron, which I had read somewhere that Varrath-iron dragons require in higher quantities than other bloodlines. I do not know where I read that. I read a great deal. I have worked soup lines long enough that I have developed the habit of learning what the people in the queue need before they know how to ask. They were not people. I want to be precise about that, not in the diminishing way, but in the specific way. They were Varrath-iron Warpack, which means they had a pride architecture I was entirely unqualified to navigate, and a communication protocol that involved a silence so absolute it sounded like contempt if you did not know the difference. I did not know the difference. But I knew hunger. I have always known hunger. It does not look the same on every species, but it has the same weight, the same particular quality of stillness in a body that is trying not to show you that it is diminishing. I saw that in the pack by the end of the 1st week, and after that there was no logistical argument required. The young female started appearing at the gantry steps around the 4th week. She was the smallest of the 7, probably the youngest, though I do not know Varrath-iron aging markers, and she had a long scar across her left front shoulder that had healed badly, pulling the scale plate at an angle that must have been uncomfortable. She would sit at the top of the steps and watch the morning prep. She never came closer. She never made a sound. She had eyes the color of river iron in winter. I started talking to her while I worked. Not at her, just talking, the way I talk to myself during the early prep when the dock is quiet, and the only sounds are the burners and the station ventilation cycling. I told her about the broth ratios. I told her the grain bread was coming out better because I had found a different yeast culture in the station's secondary stores. I told her, one morning in the 5th week, that I hoped her shoulder was giving her less trouble than it looked. She put her chin on the top step. Just that, her chin on the step, her eyes half closed. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds before Varrath-iron made a sound from the shadows and she pulled back. But she came back the next morning, and the morning after that. I did not tell anyone what I was doing, not because I thought it was wrong, I did not think about it in those terms, but because it did not seem like something that required an announcement. I was running a soup line. The line had 7 more in it than the roster showed. This was, in my experience, how soup lines work. The authorization dispute resolved itself in the 6th week. I know that because I came down the service corridor on a Tuesday morning, and the bay was full of light and people, station officials, a Varrath conclave transit delegate, 2 Port Authority inspectors, and the pack was standing in formation on the dock in a way I had not seen them stand before. Ridge plates high, tails still. That particular alignment that means something formal is happening. I stopped at the corridor entrance because I did not belong in whatever this was. The delegate was a Varrath-iron himself, older, heavier through the chest, his ridge plates carrying sigils I did not recognize. He was speaking to Varrath-iron in a dialect I could not follow. She answered once briefly. He went still. Then he turned and looked at me. I was holding a stock pot. I had not yet put it down. He walked the length of the dock toward me, which took some time because the dock is long and he was not hurrying. He stopped 4 feet away. He was very large. He smelled like hot iron and open sky and something else I could not name. He said in station common, "You are the one who kept the pack fed." I said that I ran the soup line, and there had been surplus. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is no surplus in a refugee processing dock. You made room." I did not have an answer for that. He lowered his head. Not a bow, not the formal version of it, not the ceremonial inclination I had seen in footage of Varrath conclave proceedings. He lowered his head slowly, until his chin touched the deck, right there in the service corridor, in front of the stock pot and the morning prep smells, and the 11 years of nothing in particular that made up my working life on Veth Station. He held it for a breath, then he raised his head and said, "The Varrath Emperor sends his recognition, Varrath-Keth, she who made room." I said I did not know what that meant. He said, "It means your name in our language is now a word for a specific kind of generosity, the kind that does not announce itself." The pack shipped out that afternoon. Varrath-iron walked past me on the way to the transport. She did not stop. But the young one, the one with the bad shoulder, paused at the corridor entrance and looked back. I raised a hand. She dropped her chin once slowly and then followed the others. I washed the stock pots. I logged the surplus numbers. I filed the morning roster for the lunch queue, which had its usual 140 names on it. The next morning I was at the burners by 5, same as always. The dock was quiet. The bay gantry was empty. I made the broth the usual way, and I left the extra pot at the base of the steps anyway, because the habit had gotten into me, and because some mornings the surplus finds somewhere to go even when you cannot see where that is yet. It is always good to keep a pot ready.